Hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at the Arab Gulf States Institute. We're continuing our coverage of current events here at AGSI amid escalating conflict in the Middle East by looking at the candidates in the upcoming U.S. presidential election and what each may bring in terms of change or continuity to U.S. policy in the region. And we have a truly stellar panel of experts with us today to help us do that. I'll introduce them very briefly here and share a full link to their bios in the chat. First, I'd like to welcome Kirsten Fontenrose. She is the president of the advisory firm Red 6 International. Kirsten has 20 plus years of experience working on national security issues with nations in the Middle East and Africa from positions within the U.S. Department of Defense, State, the White House, private industry, and the nonprofit sector. Her most recent government service was as Senior Director for Gulf Affairs at the National Security Council. Previously, she was the Director of the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, where she remains a non-resident fellow. Also, warm welcome to Brian Katulis. He is the Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Middle East Institute. He was formerly a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the center's Middle East program and also worked on broader U.S. national security issues. His past experience includes work at the National Security Council and the U.S. Departments of State and Defense. Last but not least is my colleague Hussein Ibish. Hussein is a senior resident scholar at AGSI. He is a weekly columnist for The National, a regular contributor to The Atlantic and The Daily Beast, and a frequent contributor to many other U.S. and Middle Eastern publications. Moderating the session today is AGSI President Ambassador Douglas Silliman. Before joining AGSI, he served as U.S. Ambassador to Iraq from 2016 to 2019 and U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait from 2014 to 2016, among other illustrious postings at the U.S. Department of State. And with that, Doug, over to you.
Raymond, thank you very much for that introduction. And I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our guests, wherever you might be. And special welcomes to Kirsten, Brian, and Hussein as we begin today's discussion. Americans go to the polls in 27 days on November 5th, but in actuality, Americans have already started voting. They've started voting absentee in early voting. So a lot of people have actually made up their minds already. There has been a truism in American politics that during presidential election years, it is the economic issues, kitchen table issues that really matter in presidential elections, and that foreign policy issues don't really have much impact. But this week, there was an article written by Jeffrey Friedman from Dartmouth and Andrew Payne from the University of London in Foreign Affairs entitled "The Myth That Foreign Policy Doesn't Matter in Presidential Elections." And this article basically argues three things: that unresolved conflicts and unexpected crises can do major damage to campaigns, particularly if an incumbent is running for office, that candidates' personalities often matter most to voters on foreign policy issues and their specific positions on specific issues, but then qualifies all this at the end of the article and says that in this election cycle, there may be enough American voters who have connections to current foreign policy crises like violence in the Middle East or the continuing Russia-Ukraine war, that it might affect the way that they vote and when they go to the polls. There's also another way to look at these elections as well, from the standpoint of governments overseas, because governments overseas are watching who wins this election very carefully, who's up and who's down, and doing a lot of speculating on what each candidate might want to do, because the United States is a dominant player in most regions of the world. And AGSI's own Hussein Ibish published an analysis this week entitled, "For Gulf Countries, There May Be No Clear Preference Between Trump and Harris." This is our first in a series of analyses of issues in the 2024 elections that you can get on our website, agsiw.org. My hope is that in this program, we'll have an opportunity to discuss what the two candidates think of the Gulf, what their policies might be, and what the Gulf governments think about what the policies might be and how they might actually react. And then maybe at the end, explore whether the victory of Kamala Harris or Donald Trump will likely produce any new direction in U.S. foreign policy for the Gulf or the Middle East. So let's start the conversation. I'll turn first to Hussein to set the stage. I mean, Hussein, let us know, give us a readout of what you said in your article this week and how this election is being perceived by the leadership in the Gulf.
Okay, I want to keep this very brief because I think our colleagues Brian and Kirsten have a tremendous lot to bring to the conversation. But my own conclusion, taking a sort of 30,000-foot look down at this point at what the Gulf countries want from the United States and what they think they might get, and of course, also equally what they want to avoid and what they might be able to avoid from either candidate, led me to the broad conclusion that for most, if not all, of the GCC countries, it's a wash. They can. It's not that they don't see differences. They do. They see clear differences, but I think they see roughly a similar set of advantages and disadvantages to a potential Trump second term and to a potential Harris administration. And for them, the balance is pretty similar, even though it's kind of hard to to be sure. The first thing they're sure is that there'll be general continuity, right? This partnership has lasted, in the case of Saudi Arabia, since just after the Second World War, if not a bit earlier, and has gone through thick and thin, through incredible strife and struggles, and it's persisted. And spread to the other GCC countries because all of the six of them and the United States share a fundamental goal in regional stability and security. And whatever differences you may have, tactically, if your grand strategy is the same, you end up coming back together no matter how alienated you become. Over an oil embargo in 1973, a terrorist strike on 9/11, an invasion of Iraq or a set of policies that don't work. None of that will be disruptive. So that I think that all of them begin with the idea that they're confident that nothing that's looming is going to shake their persistent partnership with the United States. Now, what's interesting is that for the UAE, what that confidence has meant is a much greater willingness than any other country in the Middle East. So you can throw Israel into the mix and even Turkey in seeking strategic diversification, in aggressively trying to expand beyond simple reliance on the United States. And that's at the same time that they sought and did not acquire an ironclad, in their words, new mutual defense agreement of the kind that the Biden administration was trying to arrive at with Saudi Arabia. And there has been this serious upgrade in defense relations under the rubric of a major non-NATO ally, and the kind of very strong pledges of coordination achieved on September 23. But that does fall short of the UAE's goal, and I think that's reflective of a couple of things. First, I think they're going to continue unless and until they get such a kind of an ironclad agreement, which whatever they got on September 23 is not. They're going to continue to look for that. They're very unlikely to get it from Donald Trump because of his hostility to fixed alliances and what have you. And I think that applies to Saudi Arabia as well. Saudi Arabia's quest for a mutual defense agreement to the United States faces two obstacles. One is that it has to be, in order to be secure, it has to be ratified by the Senate, which means that it's got to be linked to normalization with Israel, or it won't probably have a chance of passing. A simple bilateral deal does provide Saudi Arabia what it needs, but it doesn't provide enough for the United States. Now, I think, sort of if you were just to think in those terms, bilateral arrangements, UAE and even Saudi Arabia would consider that they'd have a better shot of getting what they want from a Harris administration, because Harris represents, as Biden did, this sort of typical American internationalism inherited from the post-World War II era, and a kind of embrace of alliances and fixed arrangements and bilateral and multilateral commitments as a key to U.S. global leadership and security. Donald Trump rejects that whole framework. And so theoretically, you would say that, well, if you get a second Trump administration, that's the end of it for the Saudi-U.S. bilateral mutual defense agreement. But there is a caveat here, which is Trump's instinct to be the great deal maker has never been instantiated on the international stage. In 4 years, he tried with North Korea, gave away a lot to North Korea, but he didn't get anything back. And he was unable really to create anything with Iran, where he said he was going to get a better deal than the JCPOA. I mean, it never worked. He never created a deal worth anything. So he might, if given an extra 4 years, think that a grand deal is really sort of essential to his legacy, and therefore pursue the triangular agreement that Biden started, but bigger, better, totally different, of course. But it would, in other words, there is this psychological angle that could play into getting that out of a Trump administration. Harris will undoubtedly persist in that effort, but the second problem is the much bigger problem, which is shifting Israel on the Palestinians, and I don't see that either of them has much hope of that under current circumstances. When it comes to weapons sales, I think you get similar kinds of responsiveness from both parties for different reasons. For Trump, it's the kind of willingness to, or intense interest in throwing up the numbers and boasting about how much weapons he sold, as he did in Saudi Arabia at the beginning of his administration. For Harris, it would be reflective of this commitment to alliances and security, etc. I don't believe that a Harris administration would reinstate the on offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia that was put in by the Biden administration initially in a sort of a major misstep. I think because of a misreading of the situation in Yemen and a kind of lingering desire on the part of many Democrats to register a potent pushback against the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and other human rights abuses that did not happen during the Trump administration. On energy and oil, I think you end up again in sort of very similar places in the sense that Trump spoke about energy dominance and he went a long way achieving it, but didn't quite. I think, ironically, under Biden, the U.S. has come a lot closer, becoming, so clearly the major oil producer and even exporter in the world. But there is this question of how the Saudi relationship with Russia in OPEC Plus, which is the basic means that Riyadh has created to give a ceiling to petroleum prices, would be received. I think it could be that Trump is much more patient with U.S. cooperation, Saudi cooperation with Russia at OPEC Plus than a Harris administration would be. But still, I don't see any kind of desire on the part of a Harris administration to pick a big fight over that either. So I think you probably end up in the same place. The last question is with regard to Iran, right? Iran is making all these overtures for renewed nuclear negotiations. It's clear the Gulf countries would prefer that to any Israeli effort to unilaterally reshape that equation by bombing Iran's nuclear facilities. And the question is, would the U.S. have to be brought in to finish that job if it's started? Look, I think ultimately, there's an assumption that the Trump administration would be more hostile to Iran and hostile to negotiations than the Democrats would. And I do think you can rely on Democrats with a good deal of confidence to try to find a way to enter into negotiations with Iran if it's still on the table after January 20th, which is a big open question. Depends a lot on what Israel does. But again, Trump's decision-making aspirations, deal-making aspirations, suggest the potential that he might be responsive to that. One of the big problems with this trying to anticipate Trump administration's policies is that you're talking about very personalized policymaking that is really more politics than politics, and it's very unpredictable. As a consequence, he touts that as a virtue. Indeed, it may be, arguably, but not for third parties who are trying to anticipate what he might do, and sort of good luck with that. I think both. In other words, the Democrats are more likely to pursue the Gulf countries' preferred approach to Iran, which is negotiations rather than bombing. On the other hand, you might get that out of Trump as well for very different motivations. So my evaluation is it's a wash.
Hussein, thanks very much. And what I want to do now is turn to effectively sort of our two stand-ins for the campaigns and the potential new presidents, people who have worked in the party's administrations in the past and may have a better idea. So, Kirsten, if I can turn to you and essentially, if you could outline for us how Donald Trump views the Gulf first and the Middle East more broadly, and what initiatives he might undertake or undertake again from his first administration were he to be elected.
Sure, I'll do this in kind of a blitzkrieg fashion, and then we can dive in during discussion. As an overview, I think the foreign policy framework for a second Trump administration is peace through strength. So keep that tagline in mind whenever you're thinking about whatever his policy might be. How does it play into how America achieves peace through strength? So it's speak strongly and carry a big stick. And the Trump team's peace through strength frame looks to correct a pattern in what they see as recent history where U.S. adversaries achieved political effects with a minimum of military force, while the U.S. used a lot of military force to achieve kind of murky political effects. So in a Trump administration, negotiation will be front and center. It's what he says he likes. Whether or not it's successful, it's still kind of the first resort. But it won't be negotiation in the sense of facilitation or shuttle diplomacy as the current administration had manifested. It will instead be negotiation as, to borrow a military term, executive phase zero operations, shaping of a potential battlefield using a mix of instruments of national power to cause the other side of the table to believe that their interests are better served by agreeing to a deal than by being intransigent. And so watch for this kind of approach on issues like Iran and the Houthis. On standing requests from Arab states for upgraded bilateral security agreements, as Hisham mentioned, this is where Trump's deal-making zeitgeist really comes into play. Stronger security partnerships with Middle Eastern partners are possible, they're even desirable, and Trump supported the Middle East Strategic Alliance concept during his first term. The question for any proposed security agreement will be what is in it for the U.S., that negotiation piece, and if a Saudi agreement is reviewed, certainly that will come into play, and it will be, all the conversation will start from scratch again. I do expect it to come up, but it will start from scratch. On Gaza, as a second-term president, Trump would have more leash to show tough love to Israel than Harris would as a first-termer with an eye on re-election. But he would also have more leash to go all in with Israel. They're not actually mutually exclusive, and I think we'd see him do both, and we can talk more about that. There is a debate among Trump advisors about a two versus a one-state solution. Trump supported two states in his previous term. But what could move him away from two states, other than the pleas of certain members of the Israeli cabinet, are indications that one, Hamas or any group sworn to destroy Israel would have a role in a future Palestinian state, or two, an indication that Iran would inevitably have a foothold in a future Palestinian state, because now that Iran piece is personal to him, and we can talk about that more as well. A second-term Trump team will come out of the gate pretty ready to increase Arab state investment in the U.S. beyond where it even is now. So Saudi and the UAE, they surged investment in the U.S. under Trump, and they stayed pretty bullish on the U.S. under Biden. Of note, Gulf country sovereign wealth funds are looking to increase their investment in the U.S. LNG sector and in renewables. And this indicates to me, I think, that they see that their energy future is tied to the U.S. energy future, and that they feel like this is a safe investment, both the U.S. and these energy sectors, regardless of who is president. And a Trump team would definitely approve the Saudi investment in LNG that Biden Harris have put on hold. A Trump administration, kind of in closing, would undoubtedly robustly engage with the Middle East. You'd see continuation of joint military exercises, probably expansion. The Department of Commerce will continue to try to simplify procedures for U.S. businesses to enter markets and create joint ventures, because that will be critical to Trump's goals. You'll see State Department's projects, things like the Negev Forum, work to build concrete steps between Abraham Accord states that will put meat on the Abraham Accords bones. Those will continue. But like his predecessors in both parties, Trump does not want to sustain a large military footprint in the region. Peace through strength to the Trump team does mean improving the ability of partner states to operate alongside the U.S., but it does not mean babysitting them. I'll end there for now.
Kirsten, thank you very much. Brian, let me ask you the mirror image of that. How do you envision how a Harris administration would approach the Gulf and the Middle East?
Sure. Thanks, Ambassador. And earlier you said we're sort of stand-ins for the campaign. I think that would horrify and shock some of my friends who are part of the campaign. I'm an analyst at the Middle East Institute, and you can look at my work there. We've done a Harris-Trump tracker on their positions in the Middle East. Go to mei.edu, and I've done an assessment that I think is tough but clinical on how the Biden has handled the Middle East. Bottom line, I think if you look at Vice President Harris, what she's said since she's become the nominee, how she's operated as vice president on these issues, as well as things she said in the last 24 hours, the bottom line is that she's cut from the same cloth as Joe Biden is on Middle East questions. There was some speculation early on when she became the nominee, and even earlier in the spring when she evoked some of the concerns about Palestinians in Gaza and the humanitarian concerns. There was some hopes that she might actually, because she demonstrated some empathy towards Palestinians, she would have a different sort of approach. I don't see that happening. It certainly hasn't happened. She didn't have Arab American or Muslim Americans speak at the convention in August. And if you look in yesterday, she was on the TV program The View. She was asked, what would you do differently than the Biden administration? And this question was about the entire agenda, but I would include that in foreign policy in the Middle East in it. And she said, quote, "There's nothing that comes to mind." And I just say this in terms of, I think the approach will be quite likely to be close to what Biden has done. And I've characterized that approach to the Middle East, especially this past year, as mostly tactical or reactive crisis management. Yes, I want to highlight that there have been sort of longer range agenda items, especially with Gulf partners. We saw this with the visit from Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader of the UAE, just a few weeks ago. There also the concepts that were largely starting to dominate the Middle East policy agenda of the Biden administration pre-10-7, the idea of an India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, all of this linked also to the notion of I2U2, Israel and India and the UAE and the United States working together in partnership on what some people, including Derek Chollet, who is now at the Pentagon and was a senior advisor to Biden, talk about as the long game of building these partnerships, especially in energy, economics, clean energy, and those fronts. And I think in their heart of hearts and their sort of first step forward and how their approach would be to continue on that sort of long game agenda. But here's the qualification I'd have to say for that, is that we're currently just less than a month before our elections here. People are voting already. I know we're going to talk about how much these issues might matter to the electorate and the outcomes in the election. But people often talk about in American politics and elections, October surprises. You're familiar with October surprises going back to the Iran episode back in the 1980 election. I would submit to you, we've had July surprises, August surprises, September surprises, and we're likely to have several October surprises coming out of the region. And a lot of the things that are not so long game, not so proactive about building relationships, but is very much reactive and driven by events, we're going to see more of that. And it would be hard to predict where things land. So a lot of these questions and how we answer them are highly speculative in an environment of such uncertainty. But the bottom line is that I think a Trump-Walz administration would not be all that different from where the Biden administration evolved towards, where it entered office in 2021, and as Hussein said earlier, basically deprioritized the Middle East. And in my assessment, the Middle East sets of issues, including Iran and Israel-Palestine in 2021, were probably somewhere around 15 to 20 in terms of the rank order priorities, especially when you include the domestic agenda, which was the extreme focus. But China, COVID, and climate change was a higher priority in that first year. And then two things happened, one in 2022 and one in 2023, that drew the Biden team pragmatically to engage the region. One was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How did that affect their engagement in the Middle East? Basically, energy prices went sky high at a time when a set of fiscal and monetary policy moves were contributing to inflation at home. So Biden got on a plane and he went to Israel and he went to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and set a framework for this long-term engagement, the building partners. The second thing that happened was when China brokered this deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia to reestablish and deepen the diplomatic ties and relationships in March of 2023. That sent sort of shockwaves in a key way inside the White House, and they essentially said, "Look, we want to have Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries closer to America's orbit than we want them to be in China's orbit in the next 20 years." And that set them about this course and path towards the bilateral deals that they were discussing with the Saudis, these arrangements with the UAE. So they deepened their engagement. And I think I'll close here that the Harris-Walz administration would likely want to continue with that. But the deep uncertainty that's driven by Iran's actions in the region and some of its partners around the region, Israeli actions in a big way, trying to shift dynamics in the region and creating a lot of insecurity. And then the question of Palestine, which animates some in the Democratic electorate. All of these things, I think, will complicate that long game effort to deepen partnership ties with Gulf countries. But certainly, I think the Harris-Walz administration will come in with less of a distanced attitude towards Gulf states than the Biden team did, because a lot of the toxicity and the issues that Hussein had raised and the way that Trump was perceived in 2017 to 2021, engaging with the Gulf states, it's slightly less of an ideological and partisan issue. And it's also a part of the Middle East that's seen as less of a problem child when measured up against what Israel's doing in Gaza and the uncertainty of the war in Lebanon these days.
Brian, thanks very much. What I want to do now, especially since I was a big fan of James Carville under the Clinton administration, and "it's the economy, stupid" still rings true for an awful lot of people, is talk about the U.S. Gulf relationship in terms of economic issues. So, right, Brian, I think I want to stay with you a bit and talk a bit about energy. Under the Biden administration, U.S. oil production is now the largest of any country in the world. We are now beginning to export oil as well. There has been a lot of investment in renewables and in other energy efficiency areas. And President Biden, probably for the first time, significantly used the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, putting on the market to lower oil prices and lower gas prices for Americans, a consumer-driven activism that we had not seen in previous administrations. So let's drill down a bit more, Brian, on energy issues. What do you expect a Harris administration to do in terms of issues that will affect OPEC, OPEC Plus? How much concern will there be that Russia remains a significant partner in OPEC Plus and one of the drivers of OPEC Plus decisions?
Those are great questions. And I think if you've seen how Harris has shifted in her views on questions like fracking and other things, where she was in 2019 as a presidential candidate in the primaries is not where she is right now. And what I would expect, first and foremost, and talking about the energy issues, let me just say one thing in the short term. There's a lot of speculation about whether Arab American or Muslim American voters in Michigan can tip a swing state one way or another. I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and hopefully we'll talk about that, whether that will be clear. One place in the short term that if this war between Israel and Iran and its proxies expands to include the Gulf, and I think there's low prospects of that happening, but if that were to occur in the next few weeks before the election, that's one place where energy prices could actually shape the policy and political discourse. I'll get to your question in a second, but I think it's important to remember that despite all of this talk and the reality of America becoming an energy superpower and energy, quote unquote, independent in its own right, the global energy market is still very much one thing, which is global. And whenever there's a supply shock, even when in this current context where there's a glut, if you saw President Biden's statement last Thursday, where he seemed to hint at maybe we would be involved with some sort of strike on Israeli strike on Iranian energy facilities, the markets react very quickly. And then it was sort of clean up on aisle 7. And the next day, President Biden said something different and tried to calm things. So in the short run, I would keep a close eye on that in terms of the policy and political impact. The second thing I think you'd likely to see, and this relates to this so-called long game that people in the administration like Derek Chollet and others have written about, is the attempt to actually get better coordination with some of our Arab partners who are oil producers on providing stability to the global energy markets and to do it in a diversified way, right? I think the pragmatism and when people look at the numbers of how an energy transition is likely to occur, I think a lot of the things that you hear from the far left about dire consequences and things like this in the short run, if we don't move immediately to non-fossil fuels and renewables, people understand that that's a difficult path in the real world to actually develop. And I think one thing that's interesting to me that is a lesson that I think has been learned from the experience of the Biden team is, if you remember the episode in October of 2022, just a few weeks before the midterm elections, and there was a bit of a political firestorm when Saudi Arabia made certain decisions that some in the United States, including the Biden team, really took, I think, in the wrong way, which was they worked with Russia and they were going to reduce supply. And the perception was, oh, they're playing politics, right? They're trying to engage and hurt Democrats, if you will. And when you look back on that, and what actually happened is the assessment was that there was concerns about economic growth in China and other places around the world, that they needed to make these cuts, and the price of oil essentially went down. So main point, I think, in how they would and should approach it is to foster sort of deeper cooperative ties with the other energy powers of the world, especially in the Gulf. Because if we're going to see economic growth, and America's economy has bounced back in a big way post-pandemic and under Biden with all the investments they've made, but it would do us better to actually have a better coordinated strategy on all energy production, including renewables. And I think there's a template there. There's a template in sort of what's been discussed in these frameworks I've talked about, I2, U2, and others. But I don't know that we have that bilateral vision 2030, if you will, for each of our sort of partners that are major energy producers, both in terms of fossil fuels and renewables as well.
Brian, thanks very much. Kirsten, let me ask you a couple of subsets on economics for a possible Trump administration. Trump has been pushing the idea that America needs energy independence, has famously said, drill, baby, drill, to make sure that we have enough oil, discounting the complexity of the U.S. system and the fact, as Brian pointed out, that we are part of a global market. The second thing that Trump has often done, but probably not as much, is undersell or underpromote the potential for renewable energy. And in the Gulf, particularly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, there is now significant investment looking at a post-oil economy and electricity that is provided by not burning fossil fuels. So do you see, am I correctly describing Trump's energy policies as I understand them? And do you see any evolution in this policy would he become president again?
I think there's some nuance to the energy policy as I understand it from the Trump team. And Trump's energy policy certainly would focus on U.S. energy independence, as you mentioned, and on becoming a swing player in the LNG transitional fuel space. But he is not opposed to renewables. His position is that he thinks subsidizing the renewable industry with taxpayer dollars harms the existing U.S. traditional energy providing sector and threatens jobs in fossil fuel states. So it's not about renewables being deplorable. It's about let's make use of what we have in the ground while the world market wants to make use of it. Because just like the UAE says, just like India is now saying, the time will run out for that. And if you're left holding the bag with oil in it, it becomes useless. So his point is, let's use this to fire our economy right now while it can. And let's not falsely inflate the renewables industry, let them compete. Let's bring in investment from elsewhere, but let's not do it at the expense of these guys who are going to get laid off in the fossil fuel industry. And then their taxpayer money goes to falsely inflating another one. I think a second term administration is likely to keep really close tabs on OPEC. But like you mentioned, the threat of OPEC is probably higher under a Harris administration. And I think Trump himself would expect to be able to influence OPEC decisions via pressure on Saudi because he was able to in the first term. But Saudi pushed back on the Biden administration when pressure was applied. I think Brian alluded to that. And they lived another day. So, Saudi needs a barrel price of about $80, I think, to fund its budget. And they're looking at ways to crack down on overproducers inside OPEC that are exceeding their barrel quotas, like Iraq, to prevent the price from dropping much below that. So, will they respond if Trump tries to apply that same pressure now? We'll have to wait and see. What Saudi does not want to happen is for the price per barrel to plummet right before the election.
Oh, yeah.
Trump wins and is inaugurated before Saudi can convince the overproducers to cut supply. So once that happens and prices start to rise, Riyadh immediately gets a call from the Trump White House asking why oil is suddenly more expensive and telling them to bring it down. So, then you're out of the gate with this kind of pressure and this dynamic, which would not be helpful for Saudi, and certainly not helpful for the relationship. So, but I do think, we might get to this later, but I think there's some space for renewables in the Trump administration, specifically with regard to the Inflation Reduction Act we can talk about later. One thing, though, to mention is a side item to watch. Just juicy little tidbit. Since Saudi has poured a lot of money into Lucid, the Tesla competitor for electrical vehicles, this kind of investment is welcome, right? Trump is looking to increase Gulf investment in U.S. industries. And if that's in renewables, if that's in electric vehicles, great. But it will be interesting to watch whether Elon Musk shares any opinions he has about Saudi investment with his competitor, with Trump. Wait and see.
Yeah.
And Hussein, any commentary on Elon Musk or Lucid or any of these other issues?
Best left unsaid about Mr. Musk.
All right. Let me move on to a different aspect of economics, and that has been the focus of the Gulf on trade and investment. You've both alluded to it, but I'd like to drill down a little bit more on what is happening. Certainly, as I said, in the Gulf, there's been a huge investment in renewable energy. There's also been a huge investment in AI and new technologies. And there is certainly on the part of the UAE, probably Kuwait, also Saudi Arabia, a new approach to the Biden administration and U.S. businesses so that they can be at the cutting edge of artificial intelligence, data centers, and find ways to exploit these technologies where they think the United States has a technological advantage over China and is likely to win. But that will require things like permitting the export of NVIDIA and other high-end technology chips to the Gulf. Maybe, Kirsten, I'll start with you. Where does the Trump administration, a new one, stand on things like setting high technology to the Gulf? And since China has been a real concern, do they see risks of this because these countries will all continue to work economically, at least, with the Chinese?
Yes, and yes. Trump will definitely encourage Gulf investment in the high-tech sector, and he's being encouraged to do that by a lot of the heavy hitters in the tech sector itself, because that investment, that available capital, really can spur innovation and particularly in the defense technology space, can get things to the field more quickly, which is a massive issue right now in terms of supply chains, the transitional state pace of technologies on battlefields. So everybody's in on that. My assessment is that the Gulf sees a great opportunity for themselves in the U.S. attempts to decouple from China, you mentioned, not in terms of mass production, but in terms of the need the U.S. has to friendshore critical technologies. And the UAE in particular seems to be pursuing an almost Swiss model of focusing on making its finance sector and high-tech sectors more robust. Like, note that recent thumbs up you mentioned on NVIDIA working with the UAE. That said, a Trump administration will be adamant about keeping China out of Gulf-sensitive industries and would likely up the pressure on the Gulf to scale back some of the collaborations in sectors like defense and certain high tech, specifically related to defense and space, telecoms. Not if, but when a defense article co-developed by UAE's Edge and China's Norinco finds its way onto a battlefield on the opposing side of U.S. interests, assuming that the U.S. has a stated policy on that conflict, no matter what the origin state of that technology is. China, under the current agreements, does have the right to resell. So that's why I say not if, but when. And then you could be looking at a threat of U.S. sanctions against some Gulf companies if they, were the joint venture in this. So you're right. There's going to be a thrust and an encouragement and a welcoming of that kind of investment, but with the caveat that if it makes its way into Chinese joint ventures and then they make their way onto battlefields in opposition to U.S. goals in those conflicts, there will be a problem in the relationship.
So, Brian, let me ask you the same question. Where do you think that the Harris administration would have come down on Gulf investment into the U.S., particularly in what might be considered sensitive or critical industries or infrastructure, and what will be their position toward selling of advanced technology into the Gulf?
Look, Ambassador, I think what Kirsten portrayed for the Trump administration, I may be wrong here. I don't think is going to be all that different for a Harris administration. And this is one of these instances we love in the think tank community, and especially a month before the elections, we love to highlight how different everything is. But in this instance, there's actually some overlap in terms of how we would approach it. There's extreme concern. Like I know some of my friends, either in the Trump administration or those in the Biden administration, hate when I highlight that there's continuity on a lot of the broad strokes. If you look at and the biggest picture, the two national security strategies of both administrations, and you read them objectively, they pinpoint strategic competition or great power competition as the highlight. Both have in their own ways, and Trump, I think, has a different style, which is unpredictable. He likes to set friend and foe off balance with moves that may not have been negotiated in advance with diplomats or low-level folks. Harris is a bit more like Biden, a technocratic managerial approach. But on this issue, Ambassador, I think that there's going to be an extreme focus on how do we build and try to grow those economic partnerships, including in the tech space. The fact that the Biden team was negotiating and still has been talking to the Saudis about an AI agreement. That's part of it's one of the components of 4 or 5 different parts of a bilateral arrangement. The focus has been mostly on the security component, as well as civilian nuclear program, excuse me. But the tech and AI part of this, I think, is a key part. But this has been a point of contention under the Biden administration when they started to engage Gulf allies on this question of backdoor technologies that could go into China. And I think by and large, they've dealt with it as diplomats should do and as an administration should do, mostly quietly, getting some of our partners to move more in our direction. It's still a work in progress. And I think, the templates will be pretty much the same. I think the style, based on how I've seen Trump operate in 4 years in office versus Biden-Harris, and now what would be Harris, is going to be a little bit more, Trump, maybe some unpredictability and uncertainty at certain moments, especially if there's a flare-up with China. And I think that nexus of China-Gulf-U.S. relations is a key one that is underanalyzed, and not just in the tech and economic space, but on security and other fronts. But in essence, I think a lot of what Kirsten said would likely apply to a Harris administration on these sets of issues. And there's a bit of overlap. I think last thing is the question of Congress and whether they would intervene in certain ways, because Congress even, I think, has been very unpredictable, and there are different wings of both parties that have merged on these economic as well as national security questions that have been quite surprising.
Brian, let me stay with you for just a second. Oh, sorry.
No,
you have something to add?
Yeah, I think there is, even though everything that Kirsten and Brian have said is right, there is one little sort of gray area shading around the margins that could be relevant, which is the question of the regulation of the emergent AI industry. I think Democrats are much more likely to focus on regulating, controlling the way the AI industry, or the way AI is commercialized and developed. It seems to me that perhaps this migration of these tech bros to the Trump campaign, people who 4 years ago had the ripest things to say about Mr. Trump, that he should be in prison forever and stuff like that, are now, not just cheerleading, they're raising money, etc., in anticipation that a Trump administration would be less likely to regulate AI themselves and more resistant to congressional regulation as well, insofar as a White House can do that. And I think all of that is better for Gulf ambitions on AI, in the sense that it becomes easier for a country like the UAE to do what it wants to do with AI and American companies in a less regulated rather than a more regulated environment. And we can, as far as I can tell, regulation of AI is significantly at stake. You'll get likely much less of it in a Trump era than a Harris era. And that has consequences for Gulf countries who focus on AI, especially UAE.
I'm going to pose a question from Justin Alexander to both Brian and Kirsten, maybe a quick answer. The real question is that he's asked is, what will each administration think about expanded US GCC cooperation on green energy renewables? And I will add to that commercial cooperation on rare earths, critical minerals, trying to sort of break the Chinese stranglehold on the supply of these things that are going to be necessary for an energy transition and electrification in the future. So, Brian, where would a Harris administration be on both of those issues?
I think they'd want to double down on the cooperation that's been created under the Biden administration on renewable front, and the fact that COP28, there's been extensive discussions, but then also with the private sector on critical earths as well. I think that's part of the discussions, at least on the sidelines of the U.S.-Saudi sets of agreements, which my expectation, and Hussein alluded to this as well, big challenges with Israel, with all of those agreements going through. But by and large, I actually think they'll want to try to expand it. It may be a clear contrast given Trump's posture on renewables, and maybe that will shift. We'll see. As I mentioned, we're in a period of uncertainty. We'll see how many hurricanes can hit Florida between now and the election, and whether that changes people's attitudes about sort of the changing temperatures and climate change and things like that. So I suspect when you see sort of Gina Raimondo, who as Commerce Secretary has been one of the more pragmatic and then quiet figures, underanalyzed by Middle East think tanks, by the way, here in this town, the role that she's been trying to play in the Middle East, as well as this nexus between the Middle East, Gulf countries, in particular, China and the United States. And I suspect those efforts will continue. There'll be tricky, very technical questions, very important political questions. As you're saying, his point was spot on. And I should have highlighted this, is I think there'll be more of an effort to regulate on AI. But on these two sets of issues, because the overarching challenge still framed in the mind, at least until Harris's statement yesterday that Iran was a bigger threat than China. But China is still seen as our major competitor here. And I think working with these what I call them swing states, these Gulf states that sometimes hedge and have relations with China and Russia in ways that make us uncomfortable, but working with them on these practical issues is the wave of the future. It's where we're actually going to get more influence if we sort of solidify those relationships. And I think there's going to be more ample room in our political space to talk about that as well.
Kirsten, same question, again, including critical minerals, rare earths, but also cooperation with the Gulf on green energy renewables.
I think it will go forward. We've seen that Saudi has stated that they are putting, their super CapEx cycle that will go through 2030, certainly as a rush to meet those 2030 goals, is 75% non-traditional energy. So it's going to be in things like clean energy and in mining and in other things like logistics and transport. But I think the Trump team sees that as an opportunity. If you can invite in Saudi investment to the U.S. in those sectors, it's a win for both. Saudi meets its 2030 goals, the U.S. gets investment, sectors are supported. And I think there's a thought that this is perhaps Gulf investment into things like renewables in the U.S. is a way to replace the tax credits I was talking about in the IRA. So there is a thought that we can do both. We can both drill, baby, drill. We can maximize our own traditional oil resources while the market will sustain them, and we can partner with these countries that are prioritizing their look at a post-oil economy. The U.S. doesn't have quite the same concern about that, since that's not the underpinning of our economy, and use their investment to push forward renewables for us, for the globe, for markets everywhere. And if we're partnered with them, then we become providers of these when the market is ready to make that transition. The U.S. with Gulf partners will be in the forefront. One little note about AI regulation, completely agree with the point about where it might be stronger or weaker under a Trump or a Harris administration. But I would just say that for years now, for at least the full Biden administration and certainly part of the Trump administration, when this became more prevalent, there was discussion about regulation. And what concerns me is that there's simply not enough understanding of how to regulate it, not just here, also in Europe, also in the Gulf, and about what regulation would do to friendlies that it would not do to enemies, and then what kinds of opportunities that might create for adversaries. So the regulation discussion is pretty robust right now, with a lot of experts weighing in. I'm in conversations about this all the time, but there is concern about whether we tie our hands and don't tie those of adversaries, for one, and concerns about how do we make our legislators understand it well enough. We all saw those like hilarious hearings with Facebook and the like, with Congress trying to understand how to regulate social media. So we're going to be up against that again. There's a lot of understanding in small circles in Congress, but probably not enough to really manage the regulation conversation. So whichever administration is in will have an education role with Congress for wherever they want to go on that topic.
And Rich, Kirsten, let me stay with you for just a second and ask a question from also from Justin Alexander about whether or not Gulf countries ought to be worried about Trump's tariff proposals, either in terms of the inflationary impact of significant tariffs or their impact on trade flows or investment flows into and out of the United States. How would they adjust, and would the Trump administration make exceptions for friends, for example, in areas where they would be willing to get rid of the tariffs to expand trade and investment?
Exactly. I think your last point just made the point. So yes and no. The tariffs could look threatening. We saw tariffs on aluminum and steel and the like in the first Trump administration. And when waivers were requested, they were not given. We did write waivers for tariffs on aluminum into the Middle East Strategic Alliance as sort of this benefit for member countries. But since that did not come to pass, that never played out. But I think your last point, the Gulf has a card to play here, because they can make a trade on direct investment. They can offer FDI in exchange for some of the tariffs being reduced.
All right. Hussein, I want to come to you on what is a related but much more political question, and that is really focusing on the Trump family businesses and the profits and investment that they have gotten allegedly through personal relationships in the Gulf. So how would that be approached, first of all, by a Trump administration going forward, or potentially by a Harris administration? Is there inordinate concern, or is there something here that would have to be addressed in some way?
Well, in the Gulf, I mean, look, we could use stronger laws about relatives in power, but as long as it's fine to put your family in the White House, as long as they're not confirmed, then you might see the return of Mr. Kushner and some of the people from the first term. On the other hand, you might not. So we're assuming that the personnel will be similar. And when that's a fact not in evidence, that it may not happen at all. That's number one. Number two, I think that we really don't know much about the finances, the personal finances of the personalities involved, which is one reason why, among so many, that it would be better to rely on professionals rather than relatives. However, I think Saudi Arabia might see the strong relationship with Mr. Kushner personally as a potential useful thing in the Trump administration, but there's a strong relationship with Mr. Trump directly, right? In other words, he might 8 years ago, or 6 years ago, or 7 years ago, Jared Kushner might have been an important link between a young MBS who was crown prince but not prime minister yet, and as a bridge between him and the president. But that wouldn't necessarily be the case now. MBS is the head of government, not the head of state yet, although his father is having treatment for a lung infection. and he's almost 90. So, the succession may happen, within a short time frame. We don't know. But he's now the head of government. And I think the need for an intermediary is much less than it might have been then. That's one thing. The second thing is that, yes, of course, business dealings promote personal relationships, and both in Saudi Arabia and in the U.S. in general, because of the amount of power we put in the hands of the president as an individual, but also the personalized approach to politics of Mr. Trump, which is different than the more institutionalized approach of all other contemporary American politicians. You might see that as an opportunity. You'll recall, or maybe it preceded your work at the Institute, but at the Institute, we welcomed very senior Saudi former official right after Mr. Trump was elected. And, he's sort of speaking at a round table, but it was very off the record. But he was very keen on Donald Trump because of this personalized approach. And he sort of said, it's like us. We have a very personalized approach. He has a very personalized approach. So we ought to be able to see eye to eye. And I think that enthusiasm was manifest, during the visit and for a long time after. But when it got to the point of the U.S. kind of doing nothing in response to the 2019 attack on Abqaiq and Khurais facilities of Saudi Aramco, which was a huge inflection point for Saudi Arabia and doubts about the United States, building on many others from the Obama administration and before. Let's just say there was desengaño. We don't have a great English word for desengaño, but yeah, it's beyond disillusionment, sort of like the death of love kind of thing in Spanish. And there was that, down to earth, crashing down to earth. So I don't really see this as a big factor. I mean, in other words, I think you have plenty of communication back and forth anyway. I don't think it's a problem. And I also don't think it's a huge opportunity. I think you'd get similar forms of communication. And I'm not worried about it. I don't think they're worried about it either.
If I could add something, Ambassador, if you don't mind, just Bill.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I do largely agree with what Hussein said there. I also think America is in a period where there's going to be even higher scrutiny about all these sorts of business relationships that people who might come into a Trump administration or a Harris administration might have had at a very senior level. And I think if you look at a terrific book that Anne Applebaum just came out with called Autocracy, Inc., and she talks about the ways, largely focused on Russia, China, and others, how they use economic power and economic statecraft to wield influence and in the private sector. But I do think it's a factor, and it's a debate in the United States that's not going away. We have a Congress with checks and balances. The question you asked, Ambassador, I think if it's a Trump administration, we're likely to see a replay, especially if Democrats win one or both of the houses, of a lot more hearings and concerned questions about those personal ties. So that's one thing. The second thing, and this is only half a joke, but in the first year of the Trump administration, I wrote a piece in Forbes Business Magazine where 5 signs that President Trump leads like a Middle East dictator. And a couple of the main signs were, one, you put family members in key positions in your White House, in your senior executive branch, which he does. But then second, you keep other family members in the family business to make money outside of it. And there's other things. And it was only half a joke. And I think every administration has these challenges and issues. My main point, the first one, was that I actually think the heightened scrutiny and the concerns that people have expressed about this, I think Hussein would agree with that.
Well, Brian,
okay. Actually, guys, we are going to run out of time, and thank you for indulging me in spending a half an hour on economics. But I want to move on to a couple of other issues. I think all of that needed to be said, but I've got a couple of more controversial things that I'd like to take care of more quickly. And Kirsten and Brian, I'll come to you with this question. So at the end of Donald Trump's first week as president in 2017, he issued executive orders prohibiting travel and refugee resettlement from 7 predominantly Muslim countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, a lot of whom fall into the area that we deal with. And by contrast, just a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration has just admitted Qatar into the visa waiver program now that Qatar has met the relatively stringent requirements to join that program. So the question I have for you, Kirsten, where is a Trump administration going to be on immigration, travel, refugee resettlement, and those other countries that we will not mention that he described in words that I prefer not to use in public?
Yeah.
Even with the bans on travel from those countries, there were about a dozen of them total. Some came on, some came off, that were using Executive Order 13769 between 2017 and 2020 and follow-on EUs. None of the countries are in the Gulf except Yemen. And a ban on travel from select countries is likely to happen again, but it almost certainly will not impact GCC countries. Definitely will impact Yemen. I think the item to watch, as you mentioned, is the visa waiver program, the agreement with Qatar. The U.S. and Qatar have been working on this agreement for years, even during the Trump administration via DHS and like the action officer level, slogging through the administrative requirements, putting in place necessary security protocols and the like. But there is a faction within the Republican camp who perceive the presence in Qatar of Hamas and Taliban leadership as agreement with the ideologies of these groups versus as a favor to the U.S. government so they can be monitored. Therefore, there will likely be an effort to revoke the visa waiver program agreement with Qatar. You can expect the disaster response community in the U.S., to which Qatar is a major quiet donor, the financial sector in the U.S., and the Department of Defense, among others, to push back on this kind of idea, but expect it to be a knockdown, drag-out fight within a Trump administration.
And Brian, how do you think a Harris administration would deal with these issues on immigration, travel, refugee resettlement?
Well, I think she'll continue this effort on the question of immigration, where she's evolved and tried to tighten up her stance from 2019, but to still be more open to an organized and regular sort of system that's out there. I think what you're likely to see as well is perhaps a reintroduction of the efforts on immigration overall, of what the Biden team tried to do with Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats, but then was stonewalled by the gated community faction of the GOP these days, the ones that actually just want to build higher walls and things like this. So I think in a similar sort of fashion, she'll likely, but some of this will depend on the political environment in which we're operating and who controls which Congress and what's the pathway. I mean, she can do a lot in terms of executive orders, as we saw under Trump. I believe, Ambassador, you were in Iraq at the time during the Trump administration, and yes, some of the ironies that came up during that period, where some in the Trump team and some of his evangelical supporters in the campaign highlighted and spotlighted the very real problem of Christians in Iraq and their plight. But then the irony is that then some Christians, Iraqi Christians who were living in Michigan, were faced with deportation procedures. And then Trump had to sort of clean up that mess. Many of those people didn't want to go back because of the instability in certain parts of that country. So I think, a bigger picture, I think Harris would try to move things towards a much more practical space, continue a lot of the things that Biden has done on these questions. The bigger question, which I think will get to some of these even more controversial topics, is whether our political system, whether Republicans and Democrats in Congress can build, whether coalitions could be built to actually support pragmatic engagement by a Harris-Walz administration on a lot of these fronts, including the immigration policy questions.
All right, let me move on to the question of human rights, coupled with the very significant social changes that have taken place in the Gulf over the past 5 or 10 years. And Hussein, I will ask this to you at first. How do you expect Trump and Harris administrations to deal with the varying levels of human rights reforms? You mentioned the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi earlier, but it's clear that in Saudi Arabia, the social changes have becoming fast and furious in the past 5 years. You still have other questions in the Gulf in terms of political prisoners, also in Iran. So where do you think both Trump and Harris will be on human rights issues in the Gulf? What will be the biggest issues, and how might they affect U.S. policy?
Different. So Iran is an interesting case because I think for a Trump administration, if it is, unless it is seriously pursuing an agreement with Iran, there's likely to be a huge focus on human rights abuses in Iran. But if we're to judge by the last Trump term and by his general attitudes, at least as a person, which is different than the policies of the administration, but set largely at the top, very little concern about these practices. As insofar as the idea that they don't impact U.S. interests. They're a domestic affair and not particularly a big deal. I think it's the Harris administration that would have, like as has occurred with the Biden administration, a really big problem and a big gap between rhetoric and reality. Or as you might come in promising to be mindful or more, as Democrats have done beginning with Jimmy Carter. And time and again, we've seen Democratic presidents come in saying that it will be a human rights-based foreign policy, or at least a foreign policy that elevates human rights to the level that it should according to our values. And this is the rhetoric, it's all in air quotes. And then they discover they can't because, being primarily responsible for the national security of the country means putting the interests of the country before human rights, and also means indulging in statecraft, which is generally amoral rather than either immoral or altruistic. It's not. And this is something that inevitably Democrats who tend to have more aspirational language and sincere, I think sometimes aspirational goals about human rights than the Trump version of the Republican Party does. I mean, I think that if you were to go back and look at, say, the Trump, the Republican leadership around the time of the first George W. Bush term had a lot more discussion of human rights as an issue and democracy promotion. Democracy promotion, indeed, through wars. That's all gone on both sides of the equation. So I don't think it would be an issue between a Trump administration and Gulf countries at all. And I think you might find even that the question of human rights in Iran would be a more central factor. But between these countries and Washington could be a problem, not necessarily for the bilateral or multilateral relations with the U.S., but actually for a Harris administration to explain politically to its constituency and to the broader public why it's doing what it's doing when it has said what it has said. That is a typical problem for Democrats.
Brian, Kirsten, do you have any comments on human rights in the upcoming administration?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I think based on, again, my central idea here is that Harris will be very much cut from the same cloth. A lot of her advisors will be the same ones who were in the Biden administration. I think the Biden team, after its first year and after its second Summit for Democracy, the first Summit for Democracy was held a few weeks after the Afghanistan debacle and pullout that actually led to a degradation of human rights and women's rights situation in Afghanistan. There was less of an emphasis across the board on all of these issues, except when it was politically convenient in the case of Ukraine defending itself against Russia and things like that. So pragmatism reigned. I think Hussein raises a very, very interesting point on Iran, and I maybe we'll get to Iran policy. I do think there's a huge space where the Biden team did not evolve, especially after the Mahsa Amini murder that provoked the latest round of protests in Iran. And that episode was, again, another instance where there was a bit of a consciousness awareing about the problem of human rights in Iran, more of a discourse in the United States, as we saw in the Trump administration. But not much was done, as well as in the Trump administration. Pompeo maybe wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about how awful the human rights situation was. in Tehran. In this dynamic situation, the one I was talking about before, the next 3-4 months and then beyond of high uncertainty in the Middle East, I actually think there's some interesting discussions I've been a part of on the Hill and other places where people are essentially saying, on Iran and with the human rights question, we need to actually build a more bipartisan approach to Iran, that this red versus blue or neocons versus restrainers and things like this dominating the discourse on policy on Iran. And human rights should be one of several components of a much more stable, consensus-oriented, vital center approach to U.S. policy in the Middle East. But then on Iran, I think, like Hussein said, it'll be so much harder for Democrats to get there because the default of the last 10 years is essentially to sound like the regime in Tehran's lawyer. If you're in the Democratic administration or in those circles, you're less likely. You really check all of those criticisms that you issued in the Trump era about MBS's abuses or Sisi's abuses in Egypt. They just checked themselves and didn't really talk about what the regime in Tehran does. And my view is that that'll, like with the Gulf, I'd be surprised if a Harris administration made human rights a huge agenda item with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the UAE. But there's some prospect that I think with change in Iran and its position in Iran, you may see more voices from the left and the right essentially saying, look, we actually need to have a different approach there.
The problem would be responding to Democrats in Congress.
Yep.
For a Harris administration.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Kirsten, any last words on human rights?
Yeah, I think there's an assumption that a Trump administration would sort of ignore them entirely, and that's not the case. They will be raised, and they always are raised by U.S. administrations, just not always publicly. You might recall that in the last Trump administration, the administration succeeded in getting Egypt to change its stifling NGO law by withholding some of the military aid until that requirement was met. And it was $195 million in military, which frankly is more than the Biden administration withheld and then released. The Trump administration did also deny some sales of varieties of military equipment to Gulf countries due to concerns about crackdowns on domestic populations. I mean, it's not hard for us to review what a country is asking for and assess whether or not that would be used to do population control, surveillance, or whether it would be used to fight terrorism, right? And those kinds of reviews we did all the time. And you say no to the things that are the former. But and remember that the Trump administration also sanctioned all the individuals that were involved in the Khashoggi killing and asked the government of Saudi to shut down the organization that had sort of planned all of it, and they complied. But human rights weren't raised in a way that was public because there was this feeling that if you shame the governments of the Gulf, it's counterproductive and likely, resulted in these governments just simply working harder to hide their abuses rather than agreeing to change their behavior. Even now, when the U.S. publicly scolds the Gulf governments, particularly on human rights topics, the only result really is a surge of reporting in the Arab press about human rights violations in the U.S., like police abuse or Jeffrey Epstein references, things like that. I would say just a little bit of realpolitik talking about Congress, that the Trump team would probably not feel particularly pressed on human rights by Democrats in Congress as much as they were in the first term, when they did kind of have to listen and respond to questions about Yemen and the like, because a Democratic administration handed over an entire country of 41 million people in South Asia to the most egregious human rights abusers on the globe, the Taliban. So I think you'd see kind of a different dynamic. You might see a Trump administration responding to pressure from Congress if it happened, saying, yeah, don't go calling the kettle black, or don't be a pot, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We're going to have to sprint to the end since we have less than 20 minutes left, and I'm just jump into security issues now. The first one I want to talk about is the fact that neither the Trump nor the Biden administration has had enduring success in getting new bilateral or significant multilateral security cooperation with the countries of the GCC. They have tended to do things bilaterally when they have done them, and have been reluctant to do anything beyond maritime security task forces for most of the past decade. So I guess I'll start with Brian. What will be the priorities of a Harris administration to try to seek greater security cooperation with the Gulf, and how might that work? I will note that the one exception to this is Bahrain, which is the only Gulf participant in Operation Prosperity Guardian that's trying to do something about the Houthi missiles in the Red Sea. And also the new CECIPA agreement is trying to institutionalize defense and security ties between the U.S. and Bahrain in a way that other countries have not yet. So, Brian, I'll let you go first, and then Hussein and Kirsten, please.
I suspect the Harris administration would build on what CENTCOM has been trying to do, and I think Kirsten was personally involved with. And this, again, is a point of continuity between the Trump and Biden administration, which is to nudge the region more towards this integration of strategic capabilities and defensive capabilities, air defense, and other things. It's a long haul. And I was talking to a former top U.S. general and former U.S. envoy, who I won't name, but you can guess who it is, who was tasked with some of this. And I mean, this individual is essentially telling me that you do need the president actually even to do more than just say, that would be a good thing, right? They actually need to get on the phone and talk to leaders and not leave it to the staffers to do that. But the basic impetus, and I think it's something that's been in CENTCOM, it may even, I think, probably pre-existed the Trump administration, is to move the U.S. from a model of strategic guarantor in a hub and spoke bilateral relationship with these countries towards one more of strategic integrator with these countries. And I think that was core to the concept that the Trump administration was trying to do with its Middle East alliance, which, again, the biggest challenge is, from the U.S. side, will there be time, attention, bandwidth dedicated to this beyond CENTCOM at a political level, including the president? And then the even bigger challenge is the lack of trust and confidence between the countries of the region. Because as we know, and we saw this with the Gulf Rift that Kirsten had to deal with while she's trying to advance a Middle East security alliance concept. But it makes sense. And the one thing I'll close on this that will complicate all of this, and we'll get to it, I think, eventually, is the question of Israel. And Israel now is a member of CENTCOM and everything that it's been doing over the past year, especially in Gaza, but now increasingly in Lebanon, how this might roil and rankle those efforts to build more cooperative ties. As we saw in April, and I suspect we might see in the next few weeks, we saw also the last few weeks, U.S. military with military partners, Arab Gulf partners, but also Jordan and others, playing an important role in constraining this direct military confrontation between Israel and Iran. And I think that's a really interesting thing. I think we should have a separate seminar, Ambassador Hussein, on the pivotal role that the Gulf states are playing in trying to de-escalate tensions with Iran right now, but also advance a concept of a state of Palestine. But all of this is wedded back to your central question of regional integration. I think it's another instance where a Harris administration will try to, won't get as far as they'd like to, and as much as CENTCOM would like to build those partnerships and that network of relationships across the region.
Actually, I'll go to Kirsten next. Do you think that that's right? Would the Trump administration try and reprise some of the things that they did in Trump 1 in a Trump 2?
I think so. I mean, I agree with everything Brian said. And what part of the feeling is on the part of the Trump team is that the U.S. has been played during this administration in terms of these bilateral agreements instead of the multilateral that decades and various U.S. administrations have sought. That instead we've been locked into these bilateral agreements with countries that don't bring as much to the table as they expect the U.S. to, when what we're looking for is a multilateral arrangement, that integration Brian talked about, whether it's air and missile defense, intel sharing, early warning, all of it. And that without that, it's not really a benefit to the U.S. We're playing, as he said, we're playing this hub and spoke model versus we just want to be one of the knights at the round table. And we want to increase their interoperability and we want to help them push their borders out by being able to see radar pictures farther. All of these really practical things, but their mistrust with one another is what continues to get in the way. And so you have to ask, why does the U.S. want this more than they do? And so in another Trump administration, there would definitely be an openness to this, but I think there'd have to be a demand signal from the countries themselves that we're willing to do more with this. We will see demand signals for the bilaterals, but this time the Trump administration is going to have additional asks. Things like, okay, you got to participate in post-Gaza rebuilding if you're asked. You have to evict China from programs like missile development and civilian nuclear, and rip them out of your sensitive networks. You've got to align with the U.S. policy on Iran wherever it goes. You've got to normalize with Israel. You've got to play a role in early warning if Israel is struck again or if something comes for the U.S. troops stationed wherever they are. You've got to invest in the U.S. economy. I mean, I think there's going to be kind of this lessons learned pragmatism about some of these bilateral relationships, and the conversation won't be as easy if the insistence from the Gulf is that they should be bilateral versus the multilateral the U.S. has been seeking for several administrations.
Hussein, any final comments?
I think we should move on because we're going to run out of time.
Good. Then let me move on to the margins of the Gulf. We have a couple of questions on Syria and Iraq. We have to talk about Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, Israel.
Yeah.
So maybe the first question, and Hussein, I will ask this to you.
Okay.
What would each administration want to use the Gulf for, or try to get the Gulf countries to do with regard to supporting a ceasefire in Lebanon or in Gaza, rebuilding Lebanon, Gaza? How will they see the role of the Gulf helping their own foreign policy in either administration?
Okay, so I mean, I do think, as I think I said at the beginning of this webinar, that all things being equal, you would expect, it's reasonable to expect a Harris administration to try much harder to shift the Israelis on a Palestinian state in theory, and opening up some kind of new negotiations with an attitude towards the Palestinian Authority to serve as an alternative to Hamas and as an interlocutor towards the eventual creation of a Palestinian state of some kind. I mean, I do think, yes, Trump in his term packaged his idea as a two-state agreement, but no Palestinian or other Arab would regard what was in Peace to Prosperity as a Palestinian state being entirely surrounded, as it would have been, by a greater Israel if Israel annexes the Jordan Valley, which is sort of the idea in there. Now, since the beginning of the Biden administration, the putative author of that document, Jared Kushner, has been going around saying, well, no, that was just a starting point and we would negotiate down from that. But there was never any indication of that when it was on the table. And I do think it's sort of hard to imagine. It's possible, but it's hard to imagine a Trump administration going to bat for the Palestinians. I think Kirsten was making a very good point about the inroads towards a single state idea, which is a euphemism for greater Israel. And since that's what we have already, the idea would be, why don't we formalize it and regularize it and all of that? And it would be shocking from the point of view of human rights and the UN Charter. But I think you can easily imagine it happens. So it's very, very different approaches to that question. On the other hand, it is, again, as I said, it's possible that Donald Trump might say, well, this triangular deal, normalization for Israel with Saudi Arabia would be the ultimate prize, more than this vague statement on Jerusalem I've given them moving the embassy, more than recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights, normalization with Saudi Arabia, and a new security regime based on the twin pillars of Israel and Saudi Arabia, led by the United States, is the ultimate gift and the guarantee of Israeli security into the medium term in that country's history, and the best thing I could do for them. Under those circumstances, it's conceivable that he might push in this direction. I'm very, very skeptical that that could happen. And I think the Gulf states will find themselves, therefore, in a very difficult situation, sort of getting towards these more formal defense agreements that they're looking for from Washington, and any further normalization with Israel until the war in Gaza is over is going to be very difficult, even for the Abraham Accord states. And any expansion of it is pretty much off the table now until the Palestinian question is addressed, as long as the Israelis are sitting there saying absolutely not. And they're unanimous and categorical, it's going to be very hard. With regard to Iran, I think that it's a really interesting question. Both administrations might find the bilateral dialogues that have been developed between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the one hand, and Tehran on the other hand, plus the existing ones that already were there between other GCC countries, Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, that they all had their relations with Iran. That, in other words, there is a potential for these countries to serve as brokers if negotiations get serious by either administration. And as I say, you can imagine either one doing it. I think a bigger problem might be that if a second Trump term wanted to revive maximum pressure, there would be a great deal of anxiety among Gulf countries that there could be maximum resistance again. That year of maximum resistance, as I say, it was an inflection point for Saudi Arabia. It was one of the big factors turning countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and also to some extent Qatar, away from dynamic, or let's say, how should I put this, kind of a focus on power projection in the region, and rather an emphasis on de-escalation and rapprochement. It really changed their minds. They don't want to revisit maximum resistance. And I think the fear would be, even though the main body of the sanctions have been continued on the Biden administration, that if a Trump administration decided to tighten the squeeze on Iran rather than sit down with them and see what can happen, Gulf countries would get extremely anxious. And if they're not allowed to do a brokering role, they might get more anxious still. So that is a point of potential real discomfort.
Kirsten, I'm going to come to you with a different question about the region, because we've got three questions lined up on Iraq and Syria. While it was the Biden administration that didn't do a great job of withdrawing from Afghanistan, it was the Trump administration which started that process. Trump also tried to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria a couple of times and ended up not doing it. And now the Biden administration has changed the nature of the relationship between the U.S. and Iraq on troop deployment. So how would you imagine that a Trump administration would deal with Iraq, Syria, counterterrorism? Would it be different from the first time around in Afghanistan, or would this trend to continue pulling U.S. troops out of the region, in dangerous places at least, continue?
I think there would definitely be a continuation of Trump's desire to pull troops out of the region. He was talked out of it last time by his advisors. Will advisors like that come back? We don't know. The last time the U.S. had a strategy on Syria was under the Trump administration, and its architects will likely return if there's a second Trump term, though perhaps not in roles related to Syria specifically. But nonetheless, neglect is not a strategy, and these folks will ensure that it receives a policy review early on. But I can't tell you what a Trump strategy on Syria would be, because it will depend on what his advisors are telling him versus what DOD is telling him. But I can tell you that strikes will continue, like counterterrorism operations will continue against extremist groups if they threaten U.S. soldiers, citizens, interests. Biden didn't end the strikes in Iraq and Syria, though they decreased due to the degradation of ISIS from previous years. There was just less necessity, but now we're seeing a resurgence. And these strikes have stayed mostly under the radar. The international community hasn't really blinked at them. So if they're needed, they're going to continue, especially now that we are seeing that uptick. Trump will want to withdraw from Iraq and Syria. He likes conditions-based withdrawal, so he'll ask DOD to define conditions, but he'll ask some tough questions. In 2018, he turned to his advisors on Syria withdrawal and said, why are you recommending I leave troops in Syria in harm's way when it looks like Assad is going to let Russia and Iran run the place? So expect more questions like that if he's advised to maintain a troop presence in place where it simply looks like they're targets. On Iraq, the Trump team does see the Biden-Harris agreement to withdraw from Iraq, between 2025 and 2026 as a flawed approach, because it broadcasts to Iran, the PMF, and ISIS exactly when to plan their takeover of the country. And the agreement is seen by the Trump team as an attempt by Democrats to buy quiet until the election, so it looks like one part of the Middle East is less on fire. But like any president, Trump would do a deep dive on that agreement instead of simply assuming it or taking it on. He'll ask for an assessment of Iranian infiltration into the Iraqi military, because that's a common topic of discussion, to decide whether to keep even a training mission there.
Brian, we're running out of time, so I'm going to give you the last word, and I'm going to say Iran. How would a Harris administration or a Trump administration deal with what is the largest looming crisis potentially in the region?
I mean, that's the biggest question that looms over U.S. Middle East policy, and it has for years. I don't think we've had an adequate, complete, multifaceted response. We've had labels. I mean, we had mechanisms on the JCPOA, on the arms control question and nuclear file, but I think that's probably passé and likely to move beyond a lot of those questions and complications. We had maximum pressure, but in reality, it didn't fundamentally shift or achieve the goals there. I think both administrations are going to be forced in part by the events that are driven by Israel and its actions and what it's trying to do, which is to shape, to take the momentum rather than be responsive to the plays that Iran and its networks have been running for years, and especially the last year on it. I think Israel, and we'll see what happens in the next few days, will likely take additional action that will complicate the overall situation. Both administrations, I think, will have to, if they're wise, fundamentally reassess all of their assumptions about what guided them on their policies. For Trump, it took him 1.5 years to get out of the Iran nuclear deal. My view, he didn't do much substantially in the region except send confused messages about U.S. commitment to the region. Under Biden, which Harris has served in this administration, it had sort of fanciful dreams stuck somewhere in 2013 to 2015 about how it might approach Iran. And now what we see with Iran is a country that not only is posing a threat to regional stability, but is working with Russia in Ukraine, sending ballistic missiles now, in addition to the drones that they provided. So I think the true answer, Ambassador, to the question is that both of these camps, and this is a scary answer, do not actually know how to address this besides responding to the plays that are being run by the actors in the region. That's not a good situation to be in. The United States actually has great potential to work with partners, including those in the Gulf, but I would add also Jordan, Egypt, and including, as tough as Israel is these days, to come up with a much more common approach. And the thing that I think you should do another seminar on, or maybe we could do it jointly at MEI, is this question of the role that the Gulf states are playing as these swing powers on these crises, on Palestine, on Iran. Because I think it's little noticed, and the statements and gestures, the attempts to try to get to a ceasefire in Lebanon 2 days before Israel killed Nasrallah. The attempts that still, they take a licking but keep on ticking. They go back to the Biden team and attempt at very reactive multilateralism that includes some of these Gulf states. And I actually think that will be a key, not a revised P5+1 framework, which was an international framework. What's needed is much more of a common approach with America's Middle East partners, including those in the Gulf. But my prediction, I mean, Kirsten would know a bit more in the Trump camp, but certainly in the Biden-Harris circles, I don't see that even happening. I see people sticking to the tribal lines that they've had on Iran, and sort of the ways of thinking that are more wedded to our own politics and ideology, as opposed to the reality of the region as it's emerged.
Yeah.
Well, Brian Katulis, Kirsten, Fontenrose, Hussein, I'm afraid we are out of time, so we could go for another hour without even taking a breath, I'm afraid. And maybe we'll have to do this again. Thanks to the three of you. Thanks to everybody who's watched. This has been recorded. You can see this probably tomorrow or the day after at AGSIW.org and show it to your friends and family and colleagues. I think there's a lot of serious substance here that probably is worth a review. But again, thanks to the three of you. You did a spectacular job laying out really difficult and complicated issues. That's all for now. Thanks very much, guys.